Hello, everybody. My name is Professor Terence Dooley, and I'm the head of the Department of History at the National University of Ireland, Maynooth, where I specialise in land questions, amongst other things. Now, I've been asked, or I've been tasked with the impossible of explaining 800 years of land history in 10 to 15 minutes. But let's hope what I have to say helps, and we can always develop it much more at a later stage. So, by means of a very brief introduction or context, in 19th century Ireland, 95% of Irish land was owned by a few thousand families, predominantly Protestant in religion and descended from various waves of colonizers, from the Anglo-Normans of the 12th century to the Cromwellian and Williamite settlers of the 17th century. And these were, again, predominantly supporters of the political union of Great Britain and Ireland. On the other hand, the vast majority of tenants were Catholic and nationalist, who from the second half of the 19th century were demanding Irish independence and the transfer of land ownership from landlord to tenants. And from the late 1870s, early 1880s, these two great questions of home rule or Irish independence and land question, as well as national identity, became inextricably entwined. So one can hardly emphasize enough the centrality of land reform to Irish life, society, and politics. Not just during the 19th century, but indeed well into the 20th century as well. And what I want to concentrate or focus on now is how reform was brought about. And in order to do that, I want to introduce you to a body known as the Irish Land Commission, which was first established under the 1881 Land Act, introduced by the British government and intended to diffuse the land war and the growth of agrarian agitation that had been sweeping through Ireland for about 3 to 4 years at that stage. The Land Commission was to survive for over 100 years until its dissolution in 1992. It begins life as a regulator of fair rents. In other words, under the terms of the 1881 Land Act, the Commission could establish land courts where landlords and tenants had fair rents adjudicated between them. From then, it would evolve into the great facilitator of land transfer. But overemphasis on these two principal aspects of the Land Commission's work can sometimes camouflage its equal significance as the main instigator and architect of rural reform. So during its existence, the Land Commission's long tentacles spread into every nook and cranny of rural Ireland, as indeed, one might say its ghost continues to do today. So just to go back to the 1881 Land Act for a moment, the Land Commission was established as, and I quote, a body corporate and a court of record with the powers and privileges of the High Court relating to matters within its jurisdiction. So it was to consist of a judicial commissioner and two other commissioners with a central office or headquarters in Dublin, but they had power to hold sittings in any other part of Ireland. And as I said already, the Land Commission's initial work was related to the fixing of fair rents between landlords and tenants. So in the 1880s, by reducing rents in a politically volatile climate, the Land Commission stabilized agrarian society, mediating a change with, I suppose, a professional composure that would have been unachievable by politicians increasingly susceptible to public pressures. So it's an independent body. And as land questions move from fair rents to tenant proprietorship, the role of the Land Commission was expanded under the next great Land Act passed by the British government for Ireland, that of 1885. And now it became the body responsible for the advancement of loans to tenants to purchase their farms and for collecting the annual repayments, also known as annuities, at 4% interest over 49 years, again on behalf of the British Exchequer. 6 years later, under the 1891 Land Act, the Land Commission was given permanent status and a new role in the governance of a body known as the Congested Districts Board, which was created to address the problems of extreme poverty in the counties along the western seaboard of Ireland, from Donegal in the north to Cork in the south. And the work here would have entailed the acquisition of large estates and their redistribution to small farmers who held very small uneconomic holdings. That would have helped in a variety of other ways as well to stimulate local industry, whether that was fishing or perhaps weaving and so on. But it was under the 1903 Land Act, when the jurisdiction, powers and the duties of the Land Commission were developed, and 3 members of the commission, known as the Estates Commissioners, were appointed to oversee the working of what becomes the most revolutionary act to date. Under its terms, landlords are paid rather generously for their lands, ultimately financed by the British taxpayer, and tenants were guaranteed that the loan repayments or annuities would be less than their existing rents. So these double incentives, so to speak, led to a revolutionary transfer of land in Ireland that takes place between November 1903 and the outbreak of the First World War in August 1914, when the activities or the work of the Land Commission is temporarily suspended in the interest of the British war effort. But by that stage, about 80% of Irish farms had been transferred from landlord ownership to farmer proprietor. The suspension of land purchase as a result of the war and other factors led to a growth in rural frustrations, especially amongst smallholders or small farmers and landless labourers. These were largely deprived of a commensurate share in wartime profits that were being enjoyed by large farmers and estate holders. And this in turn then helps fuel another, or maybe more accurately, the last phase of land war in Ireland, which ultimately forced the first Irish Free State independent government to introduce its own Land Act in August 1923. Again, this is significant because, you know, the first independent Irish Free State government see settling the land question in Ireland once and for all as a priority. And before the act could be implemented, the Land Commission had to be reconstituted. And so on the 24th of July 1923, the Land Law Commission Act was passed. And this transferred all the powers of the Commission to the Free State government, placing it under the control of the Minister for Agriculture. And under the Act, the process of the final transfer of land ownership from landlord to tenant began. Most controversially, the Land Commission was given extraordinary powers to compulsorily acquire and redistribute all untenanted lands. That means the lands that had remained in the ownership of the old landed elite, very often the domain lands, the parkland, the landscape surrounding their country houses. And this land in turn then was to be used for the relief of congestion, that is to bring small farms up to a viable level. Now, the Land Commission paid landlords in land bonds, not in cash, as had previously been the case under most of the British Land Acts passed between 1881 and 1903. Progress was relatively slow, but then after being voted into power in 1932, a new government under Fianna Fáil provided impetus to land acquisition and redistribution when this new government passed its own Land Act in 1933. It was much more radical. It had been Fianna Fáil's declared intention since the 1920s to complete land purchase, but also to break up large grazing ranches and distribute them as economic farms amongst young men and agricultural labourers, particularly those who in the past would have been compelled to emigrate. And the Commission was therefore given more stringent powers. It could now acquire domain lands, parklands, home farms, all of which had been previously exempted under the 1923 Land Act. And again, these were largely the lands that had remained in the hands of the old landed elite. But absentee estates were particularly targeted. That is, those belonging to landowners who lived abroad. So over the course of the next 30 years or so, up until the passing of the last Land Act in the 1960s, the work of the Land Commission took on a variety of other important social dimensions. And chief amongst these was the relief of Western congestion. And this was implemented through the migration of smallholders from poor lands in the west of Ireland to the Midlands and east of Ireland. So in other words, these families who tried to eke out a living on very poor, uneconomic farms in the western regions of Ireland were migrated, sometimes individually or very often in small colonies, to lands that had been compulsorily acquired from landlords and redistributed to them in the Midlands and the East. From 1937 to 1978, the Land Commission migrated over 14,500 small farming families from west to east, taking over around about 380,000 acres or so in the process. And this was a social engineering project of some significance. And of course, as you can imagine, it wasn't easily achieved. The process of migration involved many difficulties, practical, legal, and technical, of which not the least was the objection of smallholders and landless in the neighbourhood to immigrants being given land to which they considered they and their families should have had a prior claim. But the Land Commission carried out its work with great professionalism, and its impact on the physical rural landscape, never mind the rural mindset, was enormous. So in summary, by the 1960s, the Land Commission had completed the transfer of tenanted lands in the 26 county area, and it had redistributed hundreds of thousands, if not more, acres to smallholders, the landless, agricultural labourers, and so on, thereby reshaping the colonial landscape of the 19th century. At the peak of its operations, the Land Commission employed in the region of about 1,400 civil servants, making it the largest state agency in Ireland. So again, emphasizing just how important it was to the country as a whole. It was divided into several branches or sections. And while these branches were refashioned from time to time to cater for changing circumstances, the principal ones remained the same. For example, you had the Secretariat, which controlled the management and the regulation of the personnel of the Commission. It would have prepared statistical information to address the hundreds of questions that were being asked in the Irish Parliament every year about what estates were to be divided, when they were to be divided, who was going to get the land, and so on. You had the acquisition and resale branch that dealt with the purchase and redistribution of lands. And there was the accounts branch that dealt with the financial dealings of the Commission, the solicitors branch, which looked after all legal proceedings, including the recovery of the arrears of annuities, the purchase branch, which dealt with tenanted land, lands that hadn't yet been transferred under previous Land Acts, the records of which would now include things like originating statements, abstracts of titles and deeds, schedules of encumbrances and mortgages, and so on. And I mean, that gives you some idea of the legal and technical issues that had to be dealt with. The Land Commission officers would also have provided agricultural and technical support to those who received new farms. It helped develop sports fields for the benefit of local communities. It built farmhouses and out offices, and it would have helped new farmers, particularly those who might not have had the experience of working good land, good agricultural land in the east of Ireland, having come from the west of Ireland. It helped them with, advisory agencies as to how to go about making their lands as productive as possible. And of course, finally, and in conclusion, it kept remarkable records. Millions of documents survive in the Land Commission Archives building that essentially inform on everything from who owned and worked the land of Ireland to the impact of divergent agricultural and rural reform ideological philosophies of the major political parties of the day. The records tell us about the shaping and redesign of the physical and indeed the mental and cultural landscapes of Ireland. They map the creation and the disappearance of designed landscapes, the reasons for agrarian agitation and litigation, the migration of smallholders from west to east, the flight from the land when small farm life became unviable and unsustainable after independence, particularly during the 1920s and the 1930s. They tell us about rural poverty and hardship, social inequality in general, the lives of men, women, children, the lengths which some family went in order to retain ownership of their farms. And I mean, that list could go on to research infinity. But suffice to say, the great social revolution that takes place in Ireland, which in large part is a peaceful social revolution, beginning in 1879, which ends 100 years later with the total transfer of land ownership from old landed elite hands to that of tenant farmers, is the result of the workings of a state agency, the state agency that was the Irish Land Commission. So I hope you find this useful and understand that in the time allotted, it was the best that I could do. So thank you very much for listening.